Dog finds missing child in the forest at night. But what he reveals under the blanket will leave you speechless. Where's Sophie? The question shot through the crowd like a bullet. Parents gathered near the campfire turned their heads sharply, eyes searching for the little girl who'd been laughing just moments before. Sophie's mother, Claire, stood frozen, her marshmallow skewer dropping to the dirt. Her husband, Mark, ran to the trail entrance where Sophie had last been seen. Sophie. Sophie. His voice echoed into the growing darkness. Panic set in. What started as an innocent camping trip now carried a suffocating silence, broken only by hurried footsteps and murmurs of confusion. Claire gripped Mark's arm, her voice trembling. She was just here. She couldn't have gone far. Kids don't just vanish, Claire, Mark replied, trying to steady his voice, though his hands shook. He turned to the other families. We need flashlights. Start searching the trails. Spread out. The group scattered, adults calling Sophie's name into the looming forest as the sun sank below the treeline. Their lights swept through the underbrush, low-hanging branches and uneven ground making the search slow and disorienting. A ranger arrived minutes later, face tight with concern. How long has she been missing? 15 minutes, maybe 20, Mark said, his voice cracking. She can't be far. It's too cold for her to be alone. Every minute counts. We'll expand the search grid, the ranger replied. He glanced at the sky. The temperature was already dropping. Claire's hands curled into fists, her voice rising. She's only 8. What are you waiting for? We'll call in a search team, the ranger reassured her, though his tone betrayed urgency. You need to stay calm. But calm was impossible. Darkness had fallen completely, the trails now unrecognizable. As the ranger radioed for backup, Mark paced frantically. Somewhere in that blackness his daughter was alone, or worse. A distant howl cut through the night air, sending chills across every spine. Claire whispered almost to herself, she hates the dark. Mark stopped pacing, breathing heavily. We're going to find her. We'll get her back. But no one responded. Around them, the forest loomed silent and unrelenting. The phone rang sharply, breaking the stillness in Jack's small living room. He grabbed it on the second ring, his voice calm but firm. Jack speaking. Jack, it's Frank from the ranger station. We've got a situation out here. Jack's brow furrowed as he listened. A missing girl? 8 years old. Sophie. She disappeared near the campground trails a couple of hours ago. Search teams are out, but we're running out of light and it's cold. We need you and Brad. Jack's eyes darted to the corner of the room where Brad, his golden Labrador retriever, sat alert, ears perked up as if he already sensed the urgency. Without hesitation, Jack replied, We'll be there in 20. Jack moved quickly, pulling his boots on and grabbing Brad's harness from the hook by the door. Come on, boy. We've got work to do. Brad stood immediately, tail still but gaze steady, a dog trained to understand the weight of moments like these. Jack loaded Brad into the back of his truck and set off, the headlights cutting through the empty roads. His mind churned as he gripped the wheel. He'd seen this before, families torn apart by a child's disappearance. Jack had spent years as a cop, chasing down crises just like this one, but they never got easier. Brad sat quietly in the back, staring out into the darkness, as if already preparing himself for the task ahead. When Jack arrived at the makeshift search base near the forest's edge, the scene was chaos. Flashlights darted through trees as volunteers gathered maps and equipment. Parents huddled near a ranger's truck, Claire clutching Mark's arm tightly, her face pale under the harsh beam of an overhead light. Jack stepped out of his truck, his presence commanding but calm. Brad hopped down, landing with purpose. The rangers immediately moved toward him, relieved. Thank God you're here, Jack. We've combed every trail, but the dogs aren't finding much. Brad's our best chance now. Jack knelt beside Brad, tightening his harness and clipping on the reflective tags. You know what to do, boy. Find her. Brad's tail gave a single determined wag before he turned his nose to the ground, already searching for a scent. Claire approached, her voice desperate. You'll find her, won't you? Jack looked up at her, the lines on his face deep with experience. We're going to do everything we can. Brad sniffed deeply at Sophie's jacket, handed to him by a ranger. He stilled for a moment, processing, and then jerked forward, pulling Jack hard toward the treeline. Let him lead, Jack said firmly, his voice cutting through the night. The group paused, eyes turning toward the dog who seemed to know something they didn't. And with that, Jack and Brad disappeared into the dark forest, the beam of Jack's flashlight bouncing between trees as they began their search. The forest swallowed them whole. Jack's flashlight cut a narrow path ahead, but the darkness felt alive, pressing in on every side. Brad led the way, his nose low to the ground, his body tense with focus. Jack followed, boots crunching against leaves and twigs, his breathing steady but alert. "Easy, Brad. Stay on it, boy," Jack muttered under his breath. He gripped the leash loosely, giving Brad the room he needed. Behind them, the lights and distant shouts from the search party began to fade. Jack had learned long ago that the quiet held answers if you listened. But the silence here was different, deeper, colder. Only the soft rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl broke the void. Brad suddenly froze. Jack stopped mid-step, his flashlight beam catching the dog's rigid frame. Brad's ears twitched, his head snapping toward the left. Then, without warning, he pulled sharply on the leash. "What is it, boy?" Jack whispered, his heart skipping a beat. Brad's movements turned urgent. He tugged forward, forcing Jack to stumble over uneven ground. Jack tightened his grip, half running to keep pace. All right, show me." The path they followed barely qualified as one. Branches clawed at Jack's jacket. Low brush snagged at his boots. He kept his eyes on Brad, trusting the dog's instinct even as the forest seemed to blur into an endless maze. Jack's flashlight flickered momentarily, and his pulse quickened before it steadied again. A sound. Faint, barely audible but enough to make Jack stop. He strained his ears. It wasn't the wind or an animal. It was crying. Soft, distant sobs. Jack's chest tightened. "Sophie?" he called out, his voice measured but loud enough to carry. The crying stopped. Brad barked once, sharp and clear, and then bolted forward. Jack had no choice but to follow, nearly tripping on the uneven earth as the sound of his dog's paws cut through the stillness. The crying returned, closer now, and Jack felt a knot form in his stomach. They reached a small clearing, moonlight faintly breaking through the canopy above. Brad circled near a mound of leaves, his tail wagging faintly, his nose pressed to the ground. Jack stepped closer, shining his flashlight at the spot where Brad had stopped. "Is she here?" he murmured, scanning the area. Brad barked again and pawed insistently at the leaves. Jack's throat tightened as he crouched down, hands shaking slightly as he pushed the foliage aside. There it was. A torn, dirty blanket, barely visible under the mess of leaves and twigs. Jack's flashlight caught something underneath. Small. So. He hesitated just for a moment, his breath catching. Then, with a deep inhale, he reached out and pulled the blanket back. What he saw made his heart lurch. Jack's flashlight trembled slightly in his grip as the beam illuminated the small figure beneath the torn blanket. Sophie. Her tiny form was curled tightly, her arms wrapped around something else, something Jack hadn't noticed at first. "Sophie," Jack whispered, his voice catching. She didn't respond. For a moment, the silence felt deafening, but then he saw it, a faint rise and fall of her chest. She was breathing. Alive. Brad let out a soft whimper, pressing his nose gently to Sophie's hand. Jack dropped to his knees, setting the flashlight on the ground so it wouldn't blind her. He carefully touched her shoulder. "Sophie, it's okay. I'm Jack. We're here to take you home." Sophie stirred, her face pale and streaked with dirt. Her eyelids fluttered open, revealing wide, frightened eyes. "My mom?" Her voice was barely a whisper, rough from the cold and crying. Jack swallowed hard, his tone soft and steady. "Your mom is waiting for you, sweetheart. You're safe now." Sophie shifted slightly, revealing the bundle in her arms, a small, shivering puppy. Its thin body trembled under the dirty blanket as it nestled close to her. Jack blinked, taken aback. "You're holding a puppy?" Jack asked gently, trying to piece it together. Sophie nodded weakly, her voice quivering. I found him. He was alone and he was cold. I didn't want him to be scared." Jack's heart twisted. She'd stayed in this spot, paralyzed by fear but unwilling to leave the little creature behind. She'd shared her only source of warmth with him. Jack glanced at Brad, who sat beside Sophie, his watchful eyes now fixed on the puppy, as if understanding the fragile balance of the moment. "You did good, Sophie," Jack said softly, trying to keep his emotions in check. "Real good." Reaching for his radio, Jack pressed the button. "This is Jack. I found her. Repeat, I found Sophie. She's alive." The crackle of the response came almost instantly, voices erupting on the other end. "Copy that. Sending medics now. Location." Jack rattled off their coordinates, his voice steady despite the relief pounding through his chest. As he turned back to Sophie, she clung to the puppy tighter, as if afraid someone would take him away. "Hey," Jack said softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Brad and I will get you both out of here. You're not alone anymore." Brad gave a soft, reassuring bark, settling himself closer to Sophie, his warmth pressing against her small frame. For the first time, the fear in Sophie's eyes eased, replaced by the faintest hint of trust. Jack stood, grabbing his flashlight and carefully wrapping his jacket around her shoulders. "You're safe, Sophie. I promise." The distant sound of approaching footsteps began to break through the quiet. Help was coming. But as Jack looked at Sophie huddled with the puppy, Brad beside them, he realized something profound. This little girl had been the protector tonight. And Brad, in his quiet heroism, had brought them all together. "Let's go home," Jack whispered, lifting Sophie carefully into his arms. Brad walked close, his golden fur brushing against Jack's leg as they stepped back into the shadows of the forest, this time heading toward the light. As Jack cradled Sophie in his arms, he couldn't help but notice the weight of the moment. The fear had faded from her eyes, but the vulnerability remained. Her body was shaking not just from the cold but from exhaustion. Brad walked beside them, his large frame a constant presence of reassurance. The dog's steady pace and attentive gaze were the only things keeping Jack grounded as he moved through the dark, the glow of his flashlight the only source of light in the vast forest. Sophie's fingers tightened around the small puppy in her arms. "Is he going to be okay?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with worry. Jack glanced down at the tiny creature, its ribs clearly visible beneath its matted fur. "He's a fighter, Sophie," Jack said, keeping his voice calm, though his heart ached for the little thing. "You did everything right. He's going to make it." Brad let out a quiet whine as if to confirm Jack's words. He nudged the puppy gently with his nose, his concern for the small animal as palpable as his concern for Sophie. "We'll get him help too," Jack assured her. "Just hang on. Help's almost here." Sophie's head rested against Jack's chest, her breathing shallow but steady. She looked so small, so fragile in his arms. The world seemed quieter, as if holding its breath, waiting for the next step. The crunch of footsteps approached from behind. Medics, finally. Jack felt a brief surge of relief but kept moving, guiding Sophie toward them. As he emerged into a small clearing, the medics saw them and rushed forward, their expressions a mix of urgency and relief. They quickly took Sophie from Jack's arms, carefully placing her on a stretcher, and wrapped her in thermal blankets. One of the medics checked her vitals, nodding to the others. "She's strong. We're going to take good care of her." Sophie's eyes fluttered open as she was secured on the stretcher. "The puppy," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He's right here, Sophie," one of the medics assured her, taking the puppy gently from her arms. "We'll make sure he's taken care of too." Brad stayed close, his eyes never leaving the puppy as if making sure the little creature was safe. Jack stood back, allowing the medics to work, but his eyes stayed on Sophie, his heart swelling with pride. "You did great," he muttered under his breath. Sophie managed a small, exhausted smile, her eyes closing as the warmth of the blankets surrounded her. "I didn't want him to be alone," she whispered, her voice fading. Jack's throat tightened as he watched Sophie drift into unconsciousness. She had faced her fears head-on, protecting the puppy even as she was lost and afraid. She had proven something tonight, not just that she was brave, but that compassion could thrive even in the darkest places. He placed a hand on Brad's head, his fingers brushing the dog's soft fur. "You were amazing, buddy. We couldn't have done it without you." Brad nudged Jack's hand in response, as if understanding the gravity of the moment. Jack's heart swelled with gratitude, knowing that, in a world filled with uncertainty, there were still moments of light. The medics finished securing Sophie and the puppy, and with a final nod to Jack, they began to move toward the vehicles waiting to take them to safety. Jack walked beside them, with Brad trotting just behind, a quiet hero in the night. They were finally heading home. The clearing fell silent as the medics disappeared into the darkness, their flashlights bouncing through the trees. The forest, once suffocating, now felt strangely still. Jack let out a long breath, the kind he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Brad sat at his feet, watching the stretcher grow smaller in the distance. The golden retriever's ears perked up slightly, his gaze lingering on where Sophie and the small puppy had been moments before. Jack crouched down beside him, resting a hand on the dog's back. "You did good tonight, boy. Real good," Jack said softly. Brad leaned into Jack's hand, his body finally relaxing. The intensity of the search had drained them both, and now, for the first time, Jack allowed himself to feel the weight of what had just happened. He had been part of searches before, some successful, others not. But this felt different. "She stayed there for him," Jack muttered, shaking his head in quiet awe. "Out there in the dark, in the cold. She didn't leave him." It wasn't just luck that Sophie had survived. She had made a choice, a brave one. Jack's thoughts drifted to his own life, to the countless choices he had made during his years as a cop. Some were easy, some unbearable. He knew how heavy those decisions could become, especially when no one was watching. And Sophie, just 8 years old, had shown a strength that adults often lacked. Brad gave a low rumble, almost as if agreeing with him. Jack smirked faintly. "You're always 2 steps ahead of me, aren't you?" In the distance, the faint hum of an approaching vehicle broke through the quiet. The rest of the search team was starting to pack up. Jack stood and stretched, his knees aching from crouching. Brad stood too, shaking himself off and falling back into place beside his handler. When Jack stepped into the clearing near the ranger station, the first thing he noticed was Claire, Sophie's mother. She stood frozen by the headlights of an ambulance, her face pale and stricken with worry. "Where is she?" Claire demanded as Jack approached. Her voice cracked, her hands trembling. "Where's Sophie?" Jack's face softened. "She's okay. The medics are taking care of her right now. She's safe, Claire. She's alive." Claire's breath hitched and she sagged as if her body couldn't bear the relief. "She's okay?" "She's okay," Jack reassured her, his voice steady. "She's tired, cold, but she's strong. Stronger than most people I've known." Claire reached for Jack's hand, clutching it tightly. "Thank you. Thank you so much." Jack nodded, but before he could respond, Brad pushed forward gently as if sensing the moment. Claire turned her teary gaze to the golden retriever. "Is this him?" she asked softly, crouching down. Jack smiled faintly. "That's Brad. He's the real hero here." Claire ran her fingers through Brad's golden fur, her tears falling freely now. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for bringing my baby back." Brad sat still, his gaze calm and understanding as though he knew the weight of her words. Jack watched the scene unfold, his heart full in a way he hadn't felt in years. "Come on, boy," Jack said after a beat, giving Brad a pat. "Our work's done here." As Jack turned to head toward his truck, he paused, looking back at the ambulance where Sophie lay under blankets, the puppy curled up next to her. The sight lingered in his mind, a little girl who refused to give up on something so small, so fragile. "Sometimes," Jack muttered to himself, "heroes come in the smallest packages." Brad barked softly as if agreeing, and together they walked back toward the truck, the weight of the night finally starting to lift. Jack drove in silence, his hands firm on the wheel as the forest gradually gave way to open roads. The distant glow of the small town beckoned ahead, but his mind lingered in the trees they'd left behind. Brad sat in the passenger seat, head resting on the dashboard, his eyes half closed but still watchful. The soft hum of the engine was the only sound between them. The events of the night replayed like scenes in Jack's mind. Sophie curled under the blanket, her fragile voice asking about the puppy, and Brad's determined persistence to find her when all hope seemed lost. Jack glanced at his partner, his voice low and thoughtful. "You knew, didn't you, boy? You always know." Brad's ears flicked slightly, though he didn't lift his head. Jack smiled faintly, shaking his head as the reality of the night settled in. People would call Brad a hero, and they wouldn't be wrong, but there was something else. Something deeper. She wouldn't leave him, Jack murmured to himself. That little girl risked everything to keep him warm. He remembered the look in Sophie's eyes, innocent, scared, but fiercely protective. A child, alone in the dark, had chosen to stay put not for herself but for a creature smaller and weaker than she was. It was the kind of bravery most adults never found in themselves. The quiet broke as Jack's radio crackled to life. It was Frank from the ranger station. "Jack, come in. How's everything looking on your end?" Jack grabbed the handheld, his tone steady. "She's safe, Frank. The medics took her straight to the hospital. You can stand down the teams." "Copy that," Frank replied, his voice tinged with relief. "You and Brad really pulled it off tonight." Jack glanced at Brad and smirked. "Couldn't have done it without the kid. Or him. Let's just say the whole town owes you both one. Drive safe, Jack. You deserve some rest." The line went dead, leaving the truck in quiet once more. Jack eased his foot off the gas as he passed the outskirts of town, the dim lights of homes appearing in the distance. He could already imagine families inside, fast asleep, unaware of how close they'd come to another tragedy. As he turned onto his street, Jack's thoughts drifted to Sophie again. He knew the hospital would take care of her, but the puppy. Jack wasn't sure where he'd end up. The little thing was in rough shape. Animal control would probably take him, and then who knew? Jack parked in the driveway, killing the engine. Brad perked up immediately, sensing they were home. The lab's tail thumped softly against the seat. Jack rubbed his face with his hands, exhaustion starting to settle into his bones. "Let's get some sleep, partner," he muttered, opening the door. Brad hopped out, stretching lazily before following Jack up the porch steps. Inside, Jack dropped his keys onto the counter and fell into his old recliner with a sigh. He watched Brad settle into his spot near the door, circling once before lying down. For a moment, everything was still, peaceful. But Jack's thoughts wouldn't stop. He couldn't shake the image of Sophie clutching that puppy, refusing to leave him behind. "You know," Jack said aloud, looking at Brad, "I think we might need to check on that little guy tomorrow." Brad's tail thumped in response as if he'd been waiting for Jack to say it. Jack chuckled softly, resting his head against the chair. "Yeah, I thought so." The house fell silent, but the weight of the night felt different now, lighter somehow. Jack closed his eyes, knowing that, for Sophie and that tiny puppy, things were going to be okay. The morning light spilled through the blinds, painting the living room in soft gold. Jack stirred in his recliner, stiff from the night before, the events replaying like a quiet echo in his mind. He rubbed his eyes and glanced toward the door, where Brad was already awake, sitting up with his ears perked. Jack smirked faintly. "Morning, partner. Didn't get much sleep, did you?" Brad's tail thumped gently against the floor, his gaze fixed on Jack as though waiting for him to move. Jack stretched, wincing at the ache in his back. All right. I know what you're thinking." The little puppy was still on his mind. Jack didn't know why it mattered so much. After all, he'd seen worse situations during his years as a cop, but there was something about Sophie's small arms wrapped around that trembling creature. She'd risked everything to keep him safe, and Jack couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't over yet. After a quick cup of coffee and a slice of toast, Jack grabbed his coat and whistled for Brad. "Come on, boy. We've got someplace to be." The drive to the vet clinic wasn't long, but Jack's thoughts kept wandering. He wasn't even sure if the puppy would be there. Maybe animal control had taken him already, or the vet had deemed him too weak. Jack shook the thought from his head. He'd seen enough of the harsh world to know that sometimes, a little bit of kindness made all the difference. When Jack parked outside the clinic, Brad leapt eagerly from the truck. Jack followed, pushing open the glass door to the faint sound of bells. The receptionist, a young woman with tired eyes but a warm smile, looked up. "Morning. Can I help you?" "Yeah," Jack said, clearing his throat. "A puppy came in last night. Small, beat up. He was found with the missing girl, Sophie." Recognition flickered in the woman's eyes. "Oh yes, poor little thing. He's in the back with the vet now." Jack's shoulders eased slightly. "He's alive then?" She nodded. "He's a fighter. Malnourished, dehydrated, but holding on. You want to see him?" Jack glanced at Brad, who seemed to understand immediately, his tail wagging with anticipation. "Yeah, we'd like that." The receptionist led them into the back, where rows of kennels lined the walls. The soft whimpers and barks of recovering animals filled the space, but Jack's focus zeroed in on a small crate near the end. The puppy lay curled on a towel, his thin frame rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. A faint patch of fur had been shaved on his side wherein 4 now delivered fluids. Brad approached first, pressing his nose to the bars of the crate and letting out a soft whine. The puppy stirred, blinking up at the golden retriever before letting out a tiny, weak bark. Jack crouched down beside Brad, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Hey there, little guy. You gave us all a scare, you know that?" The puppy's tail twitched faintly, his eyes bright despite the exhaustion in his body. Jack studied him for a moment, seeing more than just a stray. He saw a survivor, a little creature who had somehow given Sophie the courage to hold on through the night. The vet appeared, wiping his hands on his coat. "He's lucky," the man said. "Another night out there and I'm not sure he would have made it." Jack nodded, his voice quiet. "Sophie saved him." "They saved each other, really?" The vet smiled. "You planning to take him?" Jack blinked, caught off guard. "What?" "No, I just wanted to check on him." Brad turned his head toward Jack, his brown eyes steady and expectant. Jack sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. He'd seen that look before. Brad didn't need to say anything for Jack to know exactly what he was thinking. The vet chuckled softly. "Well, he needs someone. And I can't imagine a better pair than you two." Jack stared at the little puppy, whose eyes were now fixed on him. Something inside him softened, the same feeling he'd had in the forest when he first saw Sophie cradling him. "All right," Jack said finally, shaking his head with a small grin. "But you're not riding up front, you hear me?" Brad barked happily as if sealing the deal. The vet handed Jack the small crate, and as he carried it back to the truck, he couldn't help but feel that this little guy wasn't just a stray. He was a reminder, of resilience, of kindness, of the unexpected ways life brought people, and animals, together. Jack placed the crate gently on the passenger seat, and Brad hopped up beside it, settling in as if everything was exactly how it was meant to be. "Let's go home, boys," Jack said softly, turning the key in the ignition. And as the truck rumbled to life, Jack couldn't help but feel that this wasn't an ending, it was a beginning. The sun hung low over the park, casting golden streaks across the playground where children's laughter carried through the crisp morning air. The sound was light and pure like music. Jack sat on a weathered bench, hands resting loosely on his knees, watching the scene unfold in front of him. Sophie was there, her cheeks flushed with color, her giggles ringing out as she ran across the grass. In her arms, the small puppy bounced playfully, his thin frame now stronger, his fur soft and golden in the sunlight. He chased after Sophie's outstretched arms, his tail wagging wildly. Jack glanced down at Brad, who lay stretched beside the bench, his head resting on his paws. The older dog watched the puppy's every move, his gaze steady, almost paternal. Jack smiled faintly. "Looks like you're teaching him well, partner." Brad's tail thumped against the ground, his contentment undeniable. Sophie ran up to Jack then, her eyes bright and happy as she cradled the puppy in her arms. "Mr. Jack. He learned how to fetch." Jack leaned forward with a smile, ruffling the puppy's ear gently. "I see that, kiddo. You've been working hard with him, huh?" Sophie nodded enthusiastically, glancing at Brad with admiration. "Brad's helping too. He's the best teacher." Jack chuckled. "Yeah, he's got a way of showing us the ropes." Claire stood nearby, watching her daughter with a mixture of gratitude and relief. She approached Jack quietly, folding her arms as she looked out at the children playing. "She hasn't stopped talking about you. About Brad. And about that night." Jack turned his gaze to her, his expression calm. "She's tough, your girl. Smarter and braver than most adults I know." Claire smiled softly, her voice thick with emotion. "She wouldn't have made it if it weren't for you and Brad. You gave us back more than just Sophie that night." Jack shrugged lightly, though the words settled deep in his chest. "All we did was find her. She saved herself. And that little guy too." As if on cue, the puppy wriggled out of Sophie's arms and sprinted across the grass again, barking joyfully as he tumbled with Brad. The older dog gave a patient huff, standing to chase him gently, their movements perfectly in sync, teacher and student, protector and companion. "They named him Lucky, you know," Claire said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. Sophie picked it. "She said it's because they were both lucky to find each other that night." Jack's throat tightened slightly, though he kept his eyes on the dogs. "That's a good name." Claire nodded, her voice quieter now. "She wants you and Brad to visit whenever you can. Your family now." Jack swallowed, his heart full in a way he hadn't felt in years. "We'll be here," he said simply. Sophie's voice carried through the air again as she called out to Brad and Lucky, her joy infectious. Jack leaned back against the bench, letting the warmth of the sun sink into his skin. For years he'd spent his life searching for answers, for justice, for peace. That night in the forest had given him something he hadn't expected, a second chance. Beside him, Brad settled back down, his golden coat gleaming in the light. Jack reached down and scratched behind his ears. "We did good, didn't we, boy?" Brad's tail wagged lazily and Jack knew the answer. Out in the field, Sophie ran with Lucky, her laughter echoing across the park. It was a sound Jack would carry with him for a long, long time. And for the first time in years, Jack let himself believe that the world, despite its darkness, still had moments of light. Sometimes, it's in the darkest moments that the smallest gestures of kindness shine the brightest. Sophie's bravery, Lucky's resilience, and Brad's unshakable loyalty remind us that heroes come in all forms, whether human or animal. This story isn't just about survival, it's about hope, connection, and the unspoken bond that saves lives. If this story touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Share this video with someone who needs a little hope today. Leave a comment below. What did this story teach you about courage and kindness? And remember, when you like, share, and subscribe, you help these stories reach more people who need to believe that light can be found, even in the darkest nights. Be part of this community. Be part of the light. Because sometimes all it takes is one story to change someone's day, or their life.